Now, unless you haven't been paying attention, you all know that Tudor here is sister brand to the mighty Rolex. Now, you knew that, and I knew that, because we're watch nerds, of course we do. But does the average person on the high street know that? They see David Beckham or Lady Gaga wearing a flashy watch, but what are they? Well, I think maybe Tudor is trying to get the message across. So in this brochure, which is pretty good quality, there's actually a foreword by Hans Wilsdorf himself. And I imagine the marketeer that he was, if he was still around, he might want to have a few words with number one son in terms of how they present themselves in their brochure. We'll get to that. But Hans wrote back in 1946, "For some years now, I've been considering the idea of making a watch that our agents could sell at a more modest price than our Rolex watches. One that would attain the standard of dependability for which Rolex is famous. I decided to form a separate company with the object of making and marketing this new watch. It is called the Tudor Watch Company." And that was from March 1946. And it goes on to say that in 1926, when the actual Tudor brand was registered on behalf of Hans Wilsdorf, and then it wasn't until 1947 that they launched the Tudor Oyster model, I guess alongside the Rolex Oyster. And even back in 1954, the first Tudor Submariner, or the Tudor Oyster Prince Submariner, was launched, looking very similar to that original Rolex Submariner. And where it man-marked it going through, for many decades, up to 1995, which was the launch of the last Tudor Submariner, which I think sort of phased out in the early 2000s. So I think Tudor have done a really good job here of outlining who they are, where they've come from, and then when you look at which is the first watch that they put in their brochure, well, it's no surprise, it's the Tudor Pelagos. And Tudor Pelagos, you'd argue, is the quintessential tool watch. It's rugged, it's got loads of lume, it's easy to read, it's no nonsense. So, worth picking this one up. Anyway, let's have a quick look at it. Before we get into the watches, let's have a quick look at the Rolex. Now this is the one from 1920. So people that were still on the waiting list for then, they're probably still waiting. So these, other than the new models that have come out since. So they open with slightly different blurb. Obviously there's loads and loads of indexes, but when we get to actual proper writing, it starts with the performance of 4 sites. And it talks about their world headquarters in Geneva, cases and bracelets in Plan-les Utes, I'll probably mispronounce that, dials, ceramics, gem setting in Cherbourg, and their movements over in BM. So it's talking about empire building, it's talking about what they do. Let's go on to the next page. Made in Switzerland. Rolex, an independent Swiss watchmaking company, is known throughout the world for its expertise and the quality of its products. And that's true, and they are great products. But it talks about quality, superlative chronometer, talks about inventing the self-winding watch, talks about precision and waterproofness. Not a mention of Hans, the founder. So this is all about the mighty Rolex. We're great. We make the best watches and people want the best watches. In fact, let's have a quick look before we move on to see what is the first watch that they mention. And I guess it's no surprise, because I know what it is, that the first one is, wait for it, the day date 36. You have to go all the way to page 133 to get to the professional range, which starts off with the Daytona. So nearly the whole book is dedicated to all the watches that in the old days you could probably walk in and get. And then there's a slither of content at the back, the Daytonas, Submariners, Sea Dwellers, etc, GMTs. They're all the watches people actually want. But again, no mention of poor old Hans. Although there is a very stern looking Swiss gentleman ready to service your watch. So the reason I'm doing this video today is to talk about Rolex and Tudor. Now I own both. Is one better than the other? Let's find out. I'm Andy and welcome to the English Watch. This channel is about me and my watch collecting journey, an amateur enthusiast with an eye for detail, always going behind the watch to look for the story and helping like-minded individuals like you start your watch collecting journey. Now if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Please also check out my website theenglishwatch.com, which has some content on there that I hope you'll find enjoyable, and there are some helpful hints and tips on how to look after your watches and a few affiliate links of the tools that I do use in the making of these videos. Right then, so Rolex and Tudor. Now on my wrist I am wearing Tudor Black Bay GMT, which I have been wearing solidly for the last couple of weeks. And if I get up my trusty watch tracker, which hopefully is already primed, he says, not primed at all. I use Watch Tracker, it's just called Watch Tracker. So if you look on the App Store for Watch Tracker, you see there's my watches on there. There you go, you can see that. The top one, Black Bay GMT, latest timing run, look at the graphs, and hopefully you'll be able to see there that it's pretty damn accurate. Hopefully that's easy to read. So it says over 13 days, accuracy plus or minus 0.04 seconds. So it's only lost 0.7 of a second over those 2 weeks. And the rates are plus 0.3, minus 0.5 seconds per day. Not bad, eh? Anyway, the watch for comparison is from my watch box, which if you saw my last video on my watch collection, you'll know is the Submariner. And this is the previous version, which is the 116610 LN, so it's Submariner date. Had this since January 2020, so not too old. In fact, I've had it just a little bit less time than the Tudor. So what I'm going to do, I haven't worn this one for a good few weeks, so we're going to jump to the desk and do a little comparison, just weigh up the pros and cons, which one's better than the other, if at all. So what we have here is the Tudor Black Bay GMT and the Rolex Submariner date version 116610, which has just been replaced. Now both are from the house of Rolex. Obviously the Tudor is considerably cheaper. This one retails just over £3,000 currently, and the Submariner date, if you bought the current version, which is the 1.2 version, that retails for about £7,500 or thereabouts. So at pure retail you can get two of these for one of these plus a bit of change. So two of those in an Oris or something. Now is it worth it? Is this one the poor relation of this one? Now as I already mentioned, the caliber in this one, which is the in-house caliber, has had its problems over the years. Mine's been fixed, but it's now running within plus or minus half a second a day, which as far as I'm concerned is pretty fantastic. Now when I try the Submariner and wear it for a number of weeks and run the same test, yes, it is equally as fantastic. So in terms of the overall calibers, yes, this one has had some problems, but you'd argue that, you know, it's relatively new. Tudor's GMT module was new, whereas the caliber in the trusty Submariner has been going for donkey's years, so you wouldn't expect there to be any problems with this one. Now what you do get with the Submariner, other than the fact that it is a Rolex and has that logo at the top, you get some upscale. So the hands and indices are white gold, you get the chromolite blue lume, you get lots of it. You get this Cerachrome bezel, so ceramic bezel with little platinum deposits inside, which are sort of vapour applied to my understanding. Now this is a very glossy watch, and you'd almost say in certain lights sometimes you don't get the blackness of the dial or the bezel, A, because of the lack of anti-reflective coating on the crystal, means that you get a bit of a milky look, and that coupled with the milkiness from the Cerachrome bezel means that sometimes I don't know, it just doesn't feel as black as I want it to. And I suspect on the previous version with the anodized black bezel, you get more of that, although I don't expect the dial's any better. But as it's a glossy dial without the anti-reflective coating, you do lose it a little. Now this one does have the Cyclops eye, which does have anti-reflective coating, as you can see, and you can quite clearly read the date, which for someone with failing eyesight like myself is perfect. Now, this watch is made from 904L steel, which is the surgical grade, which means you can go in the swimming pool, go in the sea, and not have to worry too much about corrosion. Now, as I'm never going to do those things with this watch, I don't have to worry too much about it, but it does also protect it from acids on the skin, so it does have its benefits. Now, this watch is a little smaller than the Tudor. We're talking millimeters here. I guess the external dimensions are very similar, we're just chasing a few millimeters lug to lug. The main difference being the thickness, where the Rolex is around 30 millimeters versus 14.5 for the Tudor, so about 1.5 mm difference in thickness. Now, the other upscale items of this is the sound of the bezel, so it has a very nice, refined click. And you'd have to say, for your extra £4,500, you're probably only really paying for that refinement. Oh, and the brand, don't forget that. So the bracelet is beautifully supple. You can see each link is ever so slightly curved, so when it goes around the wrist, it almost forms a perfect arc. The glossiness of this clasp, which has this extra sort of lift lock feature inside, is highly polished, so when that sits on your skin you just hardly feel it. Yeah, the finishing and the detailing within is first class. Not only that, and now this is not an exceptional feature these days, but this obviously glide lock feature of Rolex professional models is pretty good. Yeah, it just has very small adjustment, something the Tudor doesn't have. Yeah, so everything's easy to grip. So if this was a dive watch, which it is, the knurling on the crown's fantastic. The knurling on the bezel, fantastic. Nice and grippy, very sharp. Nice sharp edges. Again, slab-sided. Doesn't have the nice bevels that the Tudor does. It is slab-sided, but the mid case is quite thin, so I don't notice it so much. So let's just put this on the wrist before we move on to the Tudor, its brother. Now, just putting that on the wrist there. It just feels so smooth around the clasp. Fantastic. See, the bracelet itself is very, very dainty. Just hugs the wrist. And on my 6 3/4 inch wrist, I think it's not much to beat. This watch goes with everything, any occasion, any item of clothing. Brilliant. Now, yeah, I've scuffed the clasp a few times on keyboards and desks, but that's what it's for, isn't it? You can't be too precious. Anyway, let's move on to the Tudor. So, this is a 41mm case. It is slightly thicker, as I said, and it has been saddled with what is, on the face of it, quite a slab-sided design. You'd also say that despite having these nice polished bevels on the edge, which the Submariner doesn't have, if it didn't have those, I think it would look pretty awful. But what I think the Tudor could benefit from is a little bit more detailing around the bezel, where the Subby has these nice bits of knurling that give it some extra design. This has got a very, 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 now it's almost, I call it coin edging because it's almost like a coin, and it's quite difficult to grip. Now, as this is a GMT, I don't really move this. In fact, I don't ever, except by accident, so it's not a problem. But if I was wearing the Black Bay 58 or the regular Black Bay and wanted to go diving, I think that'd be a bit of a problem. I think the new Pelagos FXD, which you can see in one of my other videos, has addressed that with extra knurling, which on the crown and on the bezel. Now, looking at the GMT, this is a comparison of, is this a poor relation of the Rolex? Now, it's obviously cheaper, and you say, well, why is it cheaper? Well, let's pick a few things off. 904L versus 316L steel. Is there a massive price difference? I don't know. I doubt it. I don't know. There's probably going to be something. Anodized bezel versus ceramic. Clearly, big difference. But you'd argue that the anodized bezel on this one is almost a good feature because you can see the detailing on it. I find it quite nice. Now, this doesn't have anti-reflective coating either, so crystal wise they're a wash. This one has a more matte looking dial, which makes it slightly easier to read. The hands and indices are just rhodium plated, so they're not white gold as you wouldn't expect. But the printing on the dial as well, when you get really close, it's almost flawless, so there's really no difference between this one and the Rolex from that perspective. Now, what the Tudor does have to make it stand apart from its Rolex brother, and something that happened, a good 40 or 50 years ago, was the introduction of the snowflake hands, which have become the signature feature of the Black Bay range. And that does help it stand apart. And when you consider what Tudor are trying to do with the Black Bay range, which is more of a heritage type of piece than something more professional, which you'd argue the Pelagos was, you can start to forgive some of these features like the knurling. Moving on to the bracelet. Now, this is a 22mm lug width as opposed to the 20mm on the Submariner. There's very little tapering. Now, the links again still do have a slight arc to them, but ever so slightly less supple. Now, I can't explain why that would be. These are fixed with screws, so they're very similar in design to the Rolex. You'd argue that these fake rivets are superfluous. Why they're there? Well, Tudor designers decided that they needed to be there, so who am I to argue? They don't really bother me. This three-piece design, all brushed, polished on the side. Again, it works quite nicely. There's a few scuffs on there that I've put on there, which doesn't really bother me. The clasp itself is very nicely designed. You've got this lift lock with the Tudor shield underneath it. There's no secondary latch like the Rolex. This just goes into ceramic pushers. But the clasp itself is very nicely designed with Tudor detailing. Very solidly made. The only downside is there's no on-the-fly adjustment. You've just got these 3 divots that you have to walk that last link across. I've found that if I leave it in this innermost one with the number of links that I have in this watch for my 6 3/4 inch wrist, I don't have any problem. So it's slightly looser in the morning, tightens up through the day as I get hot, and it's about right. Now, the only thing that does bother me about this particular clasp is this inner piece here, that I think they could have done a better job and made it slightly shorter. It just doesn't seem to make sense that it extends so far past the end of the clasp. It makes the whole width of the bracelet more of an issue than the width of the watch, because it's wider. And if we look at the Submariner, you can see that piece is contained within the length of the clasp itself. It doesn't stick out, and therefore you can get a much better fit. So it's a bit of an odd one, that. Go figure. Now, if you were going to have this to be sliding out, then maybe you could understand, but it doesn't really, so I don't know. Anyway, so which is better, the Rolex or the Tudor? Well, they're both great watches. They're both playing different price brackets. I think to call this one a poor man's Rolex is missing the point completely. I mean, yes, you get loads of extra refinement with the Rolex, from the Cerachrome bezels to the white gold indices, that lovely silky bracelet, the upscale steel 904 versus 316. I mean, who cares really? This just feels like there's more value in it. Is there twice as much? No, of course there isn't. You're absolutely paying for the crown at the top. Of course you are. No, what you have here is an honest watch. Tells the time impeccably. It's got some great detailing. It's very stylish. Yes, there's some things that in the future they could improve on, like an adjustable clasp and making this little bit a bit smaller. But yeah, those are minor things. I think overall, this is a fantastic watch, and I think it's no surprise that Tudor have made it a feature of their brochure, because I think it's a hidden gem. Yeah, you can go and get a Black Bay 58 or something else, but I think for £3 to get a watch of this calibre with a GMT, this stylish, what's not to like? So, in conclusion, is one better than the other? Is Tudor better than Rolex? Is Tudor a poor man's Rolex? Well, I've got both, so what does that say? I don't know. I mean, there are no cheap luxury watches, so poor men don't have them. A poor man might have a 10 quid Casio, yeah, or no watch at all, because that's the least of his problems. But so it's I wouldn't say rich man, poor man. You know, it's whatever you can afford at whatever time of the life you're at. You know, don't overstretch to buy something that you can't afford. But on the other hand, if you can and you generally want it, always hang out for the thing you actually want. Don't hold back. Don't cheap out yourself. I'm now double wristing, as you can see, and I like both watches. Now, of course, I like the Rolex because it's a Rolex. Yeah, the bracelet's nicer. It's more comfortable. It's got that nice glide lock that allows me to adjust it on the fly. And every time I look at it and go, "Ooh, it's a Rolex Submariner," I get a nice little feeling about it. But on the other hand, this Tudor, yes, it's a bit chunkier and a bit heavier, and it's taken me a while to get into the groove of liking it, but having worn it for 2 weeks now, I really like it. And I would now put this in the not at risk section of my collection, which is a good thing. Or is it? Because that means there's fewer in the at risk. Anyway, doesn't matter. But I think overall, yeah, nothing to complain about. And for 3 of these, I could get 1 of these. Yeah, so I think it's good to have both. If I could afford a GMT Master 2, yes, I'd love one. But I would still potentially have one of these, or another Tudor in the range, because yeah, they're great value. They're not beta watches because it's still thousands of pounds. They're still the price of most people's family hatchback. So I wouldn't say they're beta watches. But do you know what? For £3, and you can pick these up for 2.5 now, I guess, on the used market. I don't think there's much not to like about this watch. So he pays your money, he takes your chance. Now Rolex, yeah, it's great, but you can't get them, can you? So unless you want to pay over list, or you've got a lot of patience and prior history with the dealer, it's not a consideration, is it? So you'd argue that Tudor over Omega or Tudor over IWC, maybe that's a genuine comparison. But I think for 2 brands from one house, they're both great watches because they both do what they need to do in the price bracket they're at. Now please leave your comments in the section below, and if you like it, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. So I will be doing more of these off-the-cuff videos without scripts, which some of you like. They're a challenge for me because the amount it takes, but I think I do enjoy them. When I get them right, I do enjoy them. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Anyway, I'm Andy. This has been The English Watch. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.